We notice structure only when it gets in our way. When boundaries feel rigid, we assume organization itself is the problem, desiring pure, unfiltered openness. But consider the alternative. Before any stable structure exists, there is only noise. Without a framework to process incoming signals, there is zero cumulative memory. Every encounter simply passes without consequence. To perceive the world coherently, you have to organize that chaotic difference into a repeatable form. A framework allows you to recognize patterns and stabilize expectations, so you do not have to reconstruct your understanding from zero every single time. This requires filtering. Elevating some details means leaving others in the periphery. As the underlying research notes, selectivity is not the opposite of openness. It is a condition of having form. Without selection, nothing can become intelligible. A structured worldview is therefore not a cognitive failure. To borrow from the text, it begins with structure as achievement. Once an organization proves successful, it does important work. But a perfectly functioning framework carries a hidden risk, born directly out of its own success. The danger is rarely a dramatic act of rejection. Instead, the system simply continues to operate smoothly. It rapidly absorbs new events using its established categories, while quietly ignoring any anomaly its procedures were not built to recognize. The exact same form that originally enabled perception now shapes the terms of interpretation. When it encounters something unfamiliar, it actively warps that new information, translating it into a shape that matches what it already expects. Enclosure occurs when the selection mechanism shifts. The current organization starts governing whether an encounter can expose the system's own inadequacy. The perimeter solidifies. The system decides what is allowed to matter. The observer is now trapped inside their own worldview. The framework is coherent and stable, yet insulated from the reality accumulating against its walls. When a system finally feels the pressure of these ignored realities, the typical reaction is frantic accumulation. We gather vast amounts of data, refine our vocabulary, and absorb entirely new perspectives. On the surface, the structure appears highly open and responsive. It successfully processes the fresh inputs and smooths over the surface anomalies. There is a strict divide between gathering knowledge and expanding capability. Information increases without increasing revisability. The organization can produce a different conclusion, yet the architecture dictating how it observes remains untouched, preserving original blind spots through new categories. Accumulating knowledge without placing the interpreting framework under question is an illusion of growth. It is simply decorating the interior walls of the enclosure. Real development requires a much harsher standard. The architecture establishes a clear rule. Change of output does not equal change of structure, which does not equal change of perceptual capacity. For genuine expansion to occur, the actual architecture through which knowledge becomes intelligible must itself break and reform into something distinct. This reorganization makes new things visible. A previously hidden assumption becomes questionable. A missing boundary becomes obvious. Relations distorted by the old way of observing are suddenly clear. Because the structural framework has shifted, the observer entering the next encounter is not the same observer who entered the previous one. The conditions of what they can perceive have changed. True learning is an act of self-alteration. Development is impossible without risking the entity perceiving. If our perceptual structures must repeatedly shatter for us to grow, it raises an existential problem. How do we retain any sense of continuity without starting from absolute zero every single time? The instinct is to cling to the old framework, assuming that survival requires the rigid structure itself to remain intact. But structural sameness is not the only way to preserve a legacy. A relation can survive its carrier. When a structure collapses, the consequences of its history remain. These surviving elements form a relational history, allowing for selective dismantling. We can let go of the enclosing framework while preserving the core connections for a new design. History deeply matters. The consequences of our past efforts matter, but they do not have the right to dictate the exact form our future takes. History matters. Consequences matter. Lineage matters. But none require ancestry to become command. the past can participate in a new organization without ruling it. This is the essence of a living form. It is not permanent instability, it is not openness to everything, and not indefinite preservation. It is a delicate developmental tension. It requires coherence without closure, and the absorption of difference without total disintegration. It is the capacity to undergo transformation, maintaining a memory of what came before without letting it become a prison. The practical movement is constant. Reach the fullest coherent state presently available. Remain open to what reveals its limits. Preserve what remains viable. Release what has become enclosure, and allow another relational organization to emerge.